There are two great things to note about this bread recipe. The best thing about it is that anyone with any level of baking experience can make it. I've made about a dozen loaves in the past week or so I can confirm it's pretty hard to screw this up. And probably the second best thing about this bread is that it is the most versatile type of bread you can make. It's a perfect shape for sub sandwiches, but also works very well with soup or whatever really. It's chewy bread with a nice crusty bite, like what a fancy Italian restaurant might serve. Make this to go along with a nice dinner or use it in your next meal prep recipe. Coming soon. The possibilities are endless, so do what you want with it. I'm just providing the goods. You have two main options when it comes to flour. Sure, you could go with all-purpose if that's what you got. The lower protein content in AP flour yields a finer, fluffier crumbly end result and gives you that softer sliced bread texture. Nothing wrong with that, I just prefer the chewier, silkier crumb of a bread made with bread flour. The higher protein content produces a more interesting and chewy bite, as you'll see later. 400 grams, or roughly 2 2/3 cups. This is enough for 2 large loaves. This is a yeast leavened dough, meaning that the rise of the loaves is going to come from the gases the yeast produce as they eat some of the starches in the dough. Contrary to popular belief, you don't need to add the yeast to a water-sugar solution first. This is called proofing the yeast, or just making sure that it's alive. I already know this stuff is alive as I recently bought it from the store, so it's perfectly fine to add it right into the flour. One packet, about 7 grams or 2 1/4 teaspoons of active dry yeast. Of course, bread wouldn't taste like bread without salt. 9 grams or roughly 1½ teaspoons. I'll give that a good mix. I need 330 grams or about 1½ cups of water to bring the flour mixture into a rather wet, shaggy dough. While it's not necessary to use warm water for this dough, lukewarm water does help to more quickly kickstart the metabolic activity of the yeast and encourages a good rise in the dough. To achieve this, I like to microwave about 1½ cups of water on high for 40 seconds. This should bring the temp of the water up to the point where it feels only kinda warm, like 1 hour old bath water warm. I'm just pouring that into the mixture, and because I don't have a bread machine or fancy mixer, and to keep things simple, I'm going to incorporate this with a spoon, just until all the flour is hydrated and I have formed a wet, shaggy dough. At this point, the gluten in the flour is yet to form the long chains that hold bread together and give it its chewiness. So I'll leave this to sit, spoon and all, covered with some plastic wrap. To keep the dough warm, I like to throw it into my oven with the light on. This will help to ensure that the yeast are kept at a consistent temperature to optimize the rising potential. This isn't important right now as I'm just letting the dough develop its glutinous structure through a process known as autolysing, which just means the dough is breaking itself up and forming longer and longer chains of gluten proteins. Good, chewy bread relies on good gluten formation. The rising or bulk fermentation will come later. 10 minutes and I'll come back. Time is up and the dough should have rested long enough for the first stretch and fold kneading process. Here you can see how the dough is stringier and doesn't break as easily as when I first mixed it, but it gets better. I wet my hands so the dough won't stick to them and just scrape and scoop an end of the dough, gently pulling away from the sticky mass. Flop that down, secure the fold, and rotate to repeat a few more times, re-wetting my hands as they become too dry. I'm adding structure to the dough with this stretching, folding, kneading process, which is essential to a good rise later. Bread won't rise without a sound structure to trap the gases produced by the yeast. Twice more, I'll repeat this process of letting the dough rest and stretching and folding it. In total, about 30 minutes. The second time around, the dough is already much firmer and more silky. I'm telling you, this is the easiest way to make bread. Here I'm just rolling the dough into itself to smooth it out, though it's not really necessary. Third time's the charm, and at this point the dough is very firm but maintains a semi-liquid nature. Jiggly boy. Alright, I'll cover that and throw it back into the oven to bulk ferment or rise for 1 hour. Now, I could just leave this on the counter, so long as my apartment's ambient temperature is between 70 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or 21 to 32 degrees C, roughly. 1 hour should be enough time to yield a rise of twice the dough's original volume. Time's up, and I remove the dough ball bowl from the oven. This smooth, bubbly blob is nearing its final form. I can practically pour it onto the counter, it's so jiggly. With a wet hand, I'm going to improve the dough's shape a bit with a little more stretching and folding. I could have done this in the bowl, I just chose not to. Up until this point, I've been avoiding adding flour to this dough just to keep it from becoming too dense. But now it's too sticky to really handle, so I'm adding just a bit as I go. Now just pull out your dough scraper because of course everyone has one, and just kidding. We don't need that. Need that. I've made it this far without using any fancy equipment. Sorry to my broke boys without bowls. Let's just keep this simple. I'm just flouring the edges of the dough ball and pushing and pulling with the edge of my hands, pinky side, until it forms a sort of oblong shape. Cut that in half for 2 roughly equal sized loaves. Sure, I could weigh these out to be more precise, but I like to live on the edge. Flour the edges of these, hee jiggly, and set one aside. I'm shaping these by gently rolling and stretching the dough. I'm using my fingers to roll and tuck the dough back under itself while I squeeze and stretch it with my palms. Here I'm showing you how I keep the ends of the dough relatively neat, just folding the ends under themselves. This one isn't wanting to stretch any further, so I'll set it aside and work on the other dough ball. Same process. Tuck, stretch, and pull. The type of bread I'm making here isn't all that important. What is important is that I can eat it. Still, if you're inclined to know, this is fundamentally an Italian loaf, or in other terms, a yeast-leavened bread with a hard, crunchy crust and a chewy crumb. This specific type of Italian bread, not much different from the classic ciabatta, is what's called stirrato, which just means the dough is stretched before it's baked. You see here how the bread I'm making gets that name. But let's not get too fancy with names. I'm just making bread here, folks. Water, flour, yeast, and salt, all thrown together and baked to a crisp so that I can enjoy some really tasty carbs. I just repeat this process, trading off between doughs until they both reach the length and shape I'd like for them to be. In this case, just long enough to fit on the sheet pan and just wide enough to serve as good sub-sandwich bread. Throw down some parchment paper, sprinkle flour over top, and I carefully transfer the dough logs to the sheet, making sure to touch up the edges so that they are not too rustic, if you know what I mean. Time for some more idle time. I'll cover these with another sheet pan. You can use aluminum foil if you'd like, and let them proof or rise a second time for 30 minutes. While the loaf babies are proofing, I set my oven to 425F or about 220C. Time is up and these babies are ready to bake. 30 minutes. About halfway through and they have risen nicely. At this point they just need to finish cooking through. And now for the best part. Golden, toasty, crispy carb bombs, freshly hatched. Stirrato, if you want to get fancy. You don't need fancy tools or years of experience to throw this recipe together. Just a few ingredients and some downtime. It's time to try making bread again. Go buy a fresh packet, or sachet if you're British, of yeast and put those hands to work. There may be a hearty homemade sub sandwich or the perfect soup bread on the other side. Just look at that silky crumb. You want that. And you can make that. Oh, and it turns out there are actually 3 noteworthy things about this bread. The third best thing about the stuff is that it freezes and thaws effortlessly. Seriously, toss the cooked loaves in a bag and throw them in the freezer. Whenever you want some bread, pull out a loaf, wrap it in one or a few damp paper towels, and nuke it in the microwave on high for about 30 seconds plus or minus 15 seconds, or until soft and fluffy and warmed through. Sure, the crust loses its crispiness a bit, but nothing beats fresh meal prepped bread like this. Stick around to see how I use this bread in a mouth-watering, meal prep friendly meal you've probably never seen before. Peace.